about it. And she will also read from subsections of the book and tell us how to buy it. So without any further ado, Nikki, could you please say hello and start your lecture?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, John, for the introduction. I'm always so impressed by the work of the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation and also Anantara. And I feel very privileged to have you host my launch today. Thank you also to everyone for tuning in. It's amazing to have friends and family and other people who are passionate about elephants here to celebrate the book's release. It's been a lot of work over many years, as many of you will know, and I'm just really excited to share my journey with you and also to read out some passages today. Rather than just look at me the whole time, I thought I would share some of my favorite photos that I took during my fieldwork. And there'll be time at the end for questions you might have for me, but I think that you can post those in the Facebook chat at any time. All right, I'm going to get my elephant photos. One sec. When I first traveled to Thailand in 2008, I had no idea that I'd end up writing the book I'm launching today. But after a month volunteering with elephants at a sanctuary, I was captivated by their beauty and intelligence and also concerned about the difficult conditions they lived in. Those early experiences were the very first step in a research journey that's taken me over a decade to complete. There are around 3,500 to 4,000 elephants living in captivity in Thailand, most of whom are the descendants of those caught from the wild decades and centuries ago. Historically, they've been used for a variety of purposes, in logging, as beasts of burden, in warfare, and in spiritual ceremonies. My book shares my journey traveling, conducting fieldwork, and volunteering on elephant welfare and conservation programs around Thailand. It also shares the stories of the people I met who live and work closely with elephants. These included conservationists, welfare advocates, sanctuary owners, and Indigenous mahouts, who are the elephants' traditional caretakers. Writing a book is a long and arduous process, but I had such a fascinating topic to keep me motivated and inspired. I not only had a great excuse to travel to Thailand as much as possible, but so many chances to meet amazing people and explore how we might provide a better future for captive elephants. I first started writing about elephants for my PhD, which was about the ethical potential of volunteer tourism. I wanted to explore whether people could help rather than harm animals while traveling by volunteering on welfare and conservation programs instead of visiting sites that exploited animals. Before beginning my PhD, I'd already had many meaningful experiences volunteering with animals while traveling Europe, but I'd never visited Asia and was excited by the prospect of doing a PhD there about animals and tourism. I felt like I'd won the lottery when Sydney Uni offered me not only a scholarship, but also several travel grants to do field work in India, Thailand, and Indonesia. I worked with a variety of animals on different welfare and conservation projects, which along with elephants included sea turtles, street dogs, sacred cows, and macaque monkeys. My fieldwork relied on ethnography, a method that involves studying cultures from an insider's perspective. As well as being my favorite way to do research, doing ethnography is an amazing way to travel. It encourages full cultural immersion and teaches you so much about the world around you. I used interviews and observations as well as memoir to create the narrative, through which I could tell the stories of the people and elephants I met during my fieldwork. In 2019, I was part of the amazing manuscript development program Hardcopy, run by the ACT Writers Centre. This came at exactly the right time. At that stage, I wasn't sure I had it in me to finish the book, but I knew that I needed to tell the fascinating stories I'd collected. The program inspired me to finish writing, and I did more in 6 months than I had in years. But I did have some disheartening moments during one part of the program where agents and publishers read my work and provided feedback. Some suggested that I should ditch the scholarship and stick with memoir, write an Eat, Pray, Love with Elephants style book about my personal journey and how elephants had changed my life. While it was true, elephants had changed my life, so had academia. Plus, the story was about much, much more than me. I was simply the conduit through which I could tell the much larger story of elephant captivity and tourism. There was a reason I wanted the book to be at least semi-academic. As an independent researcher, I was released from some of the more exhausting aspects of writing a thesis, delving through theory, for instance, which I was never particularly good at. But I retained all my great research skills, including the superpower to smash through hundreds of academic articles, reading and note-taking on everything I could about elephant behavior, conservation, and welfare. This amazing body of literature helped me to unpack my fieldwork and fully understand the world of elephants. But as much as I embraced my inner academic, I also found a balance between citation and storytelling, science and emotion, analysis and evocative travel writing. The result is a book I'm extremely proud of, which is as rigorously researched as it is highly personal. At this point, I'd like to read some passages from one of the early chapters, but first I'll provide a very brief background to set the scene. I called my book After the Forest because it focuses on the aftermath of the most significant ecological crisis in Thailand's history, the destruction of more than 70% of the country's forests. This crisis had a profoundly negative impact on captive elephants and their mahouts, essentially forcing them into tourism to survive, which has had its own negative impact on elephant welfare. The welfare and conservation projects I worked on were more ethical alternatives to traditional forms of elephant tourism, like rides and circuses, which have come under fire due to associated welfare issues. These alternatives ranged from sanctuaries to community-based projects and other conservation programs funded by tourists, and provided a home from elephants amidst more natural surroundings than standard elephant tourism camps. The first snippets I'll read are about Journey to Freedom, which was a small volunteer project I worked on in remote northern Thailand, and that relied on the involvement of the local community, those being the indigenous Karen people. Journey to Freedom was akin to cultural tourism, with a specific focus on keeping the integrity of Karen culture, despite the presence of tourists, and providing villagers with a source of income from volunteer tourism. When I visited, I spent around $400 to work on the volunteer program, passing through two small villages before arriving in Ban Mesa Top, where the program was primarily based. Tourists stayed in huts that were owned by the villagers, with most of the tourist funding going to support their livelihoods. Each day, 3 other tourists and I walked with the elephants and their mahouts through the forests and spent time collecting food for elephants. The latter lessened the workload of the mahouts, meaning they could spend more time performing tasks such as harvesting rice and corn to feed the village. The volunteer coordinator on the program during the time, Jack Chakrapon, was a wealth of knowledge about elephant welfare in the Mei-Chem region. He explained the aim of Journey to Freedom succinctly. You pay to walk with the elephants, so they don't have to go to the tourist camps to work. Instead, they can stay here in the village and you can stay here with them and see a little bit of what it's like to live here. The next day, we undertook the first of many daily walks with the elephants along perilously bumpy dirt roads that wound deep into the valleys and fields below the village, meeting at streams that glittered in the sunlight with some of the clearest water I'd ever seen. 2 of the elephants we walked with were a young male and female, whom the villagers hoped would eventually mate. The female had been subjected to forced breeding in her earlier life and had killed the calf. The mahouts hoped that she would now become happily pregnant because her health had improved dramatically and she was bonding well with the male. Though we trailed the pair at a distance due to the presence of the bull, on other days we also walked with 2 female elephants who we could get closer to and feed giant cucumbers and watermelons by hand. These elephants had been retired from tourist camps and were evidently enjoying life back in their traditional home, where they had natural food to graze on. One day, on our way down another treacherous hill, we met twin baby elephants who'd recently been born in the village, a rare and auspicious event, as twins occur in only 1% of births. Their mahout proudly stroked their heads as the twins' mother stood behind him, half asleep in the cool shade. He said a few words to Jack, who explained to us the significance of their birth. Twins are very powerful for the Karen people. There was a blessing and peace ceremony when they were born, and the villagers took their birth as a sign of good fortune. Perhaps that fortune referred to the new way of life the Karen's elephants had experienced since the inception of Journey to Freedom, and the new income stream offered by low-impact sustainable tourism that brought money into the village and kept elephants at home. As well as offering a stable income for mahouts, Journey to Freedom provided funding even when tourists were not in attendance, meaning the villagers received a regular income all year round. This has helped the Karen of Ban Mesa Top to rebuild their traditional relationships with their elephants in a more ethical tourism setting that tackles welfare issues while respecting cultural traditions. I learned that the villagers were pleased with the changes the project had brought to the village while retaining their cultural integrity. They are happy here and don't need things from the outside world, Jack explained. They say that as long as rice is on the table, they are happy. Further, the Karen did not want their elephants to go back into traditional tourism. The owner of the twins was especially adamant. He's worried because so many people want to come and see the twins and he doesn't know their intentions, Jack told me. We can help protect them by keeping them here with the Karen. Before I read from a later chapter, I'll quickly talk about what happened after I submitted my thesis in 2013. At that stage, I'd only just scratched the surface of the complex topic of elephant captivity. So I embarked on another long project, spending most of 2014 and part of 2015 back in Thailand continuing the story. This helped me to piece together what I'd been missing. I discovered the potential of volunteer tourism to help elephants, but I'd only just started to explore its potential for helping local people who live closely with animals. In this case, these were Thailand's indigenous mahouts. As well as meeting Karen mahouts, during my PhD, I'd also met mahouts from the indigenous Goi tribe while volunteering on the Sarin project. This was based in a small village called Bantai Klang, the traditional home of the Goi. Bantai Klang is a fascinating but troubling place where there are serious elephant welfare issues. These are primarily the product of deforestation and the tourism industry. But despite all its problems, I fell in love with the village and returned time and time again. The Sarin project gave me a sense of hope about the future of elephant tourism. It was a great example of how a volunteer project could benefit the local community while funding activities that helped elephants, such as reforestation and enrichment. By providing financial incentives and food for elephants, the project made it much easier for mahouts to look after their elephants in welfare optimal ways. I'll now read a section about the Sarin project and its elephants. During my fieldwork, I saw on a daily basis how the Sarin project helped mahouts and improved elephant welfare. Volunteers came from around the world to clean out shelters and enclosures, taking dung and the remnants of grass and sugarcane to spread out on the fields around the village to fertilize crops. We helped mahouts with their daily work, building new shelters and harvesting sugarcane. We washed and prepared elephant food and planted and irrigated fields of prickly, dense Napier grass. We also assisted in a small-scale reforestation project, planting native species like bamboo to rejuvenate some of the arid areas. In the afternoon, we followed the mahouts as they walked with their elephants along paths through scraps of scrub and forest, to muddy dams where the elephants wallowed and socialized, or down the long main road to the Mun River, where, wading in, we fed the animals cucumbers and yams by hand, cooling off in the murky flow. We stayed in houses on stilts made of wooden slats with thick gaps that let the bugs in, but the breeze as well. The houses lined a common road. This was a thoroughfare for mahouts riding or walking with elephants, locals whizzing by on scooters, food vendors selling ice creams and fruit from carts pulled by motorbikes, and dogs, chickens, and roosters running wild in the dust. Like the locals, volunteers managed with simple facilities. There were no flushing toilets, no hot water, and we quickly became used to cold bucket showers and sharing bathrooms with frogs and sometimes centipedes. Our bedrooms were simple, a mattress, fan, and invaluable mosquito net the only furnishings, along with a few strategically placed nails and hooks in the wall to hang clothing. Invariably, the smells and sounds of elephants would creep through the gaps in the slats and perfume the night. Dreams of the forest were common, but so were nights of broken sleep, when trumpeting and rumbling matched the howling of dogs and the strange midnight cackling of geckos. We closely observed the fascinating behaviors of the elephants on the project, wherever we were on a particular day, whether walking through the forest or rice fields, or watching them from afar in the enclosure. Enormous Farsai, her name meaning clear skies, had a sweet and gentle nature and had once been runner-up in an elephant beauty contest. There was something about Farsai that emanated peace, and whenever I had the opportunity to look into her eyes, when feeding her or washing her in the river, I felt I could see in their depths humor and great intelligence. Farsai had a rolling gait and what looked like a serene smile on her face, giving her the appearance of being unconcerned with the world around her. It could pass her by with its worries and noise, but she would take it all in her stride. I observed her closely on our walks, especially her profound friendship with one of the other elephants, Luang Luang, Golden Lotus. They would often hold each other's trunks as they enjoyed their time off their chains together in the forest. Their friendship was beautiful to observe, and in those moments I could imagine what life would be like for them if they could roam free together in a herd, able to pick and choose what they wanted to eat, communicating with each other and building a relationship unique to them. Farsai's temperament also appeared to influence the behaviors of other elephants on the projects. She was often up ahead on walks, setting the pace for the others as an imposing but peaceful presence. She also appeared to be less bothered when there was a disturbance or perceived threat, such as a dog suddenly appearing noisily from the undergrowth or a motorbike backfiring nearby. While some of the other elephants would signal distress by slapping their trunks on the ground, bellowing and forming tight-knit groupings for safety, Farsai seemed to be less stressed and more likely to continue walking while remaining on alert, head raised and ears spread to face the threat. Another elephant named Wang Dun, Crescent Moon, had orange-hued skin and was best friends with her two shelter mates, Nong Lek, meaning little girl, and Nơ Tong, a type of lily. They would play together in the dam in the enclosure, splashing each other with glee and muddily climbing over one another amidst the reeds and lilies. Wang Duen was large and quiet, while smaller Nơ Tong was more demonstrative. Whenever she was separated from her friends, such as when both were taken away to be washed by their mahouts and she was left alone in their shelter, she immediately showed impatience and distress, trumpeting, swinging her trunk, pacing and pulling against her chain until one or both returned. Her behavior reminded me of my two horses, who suffer from separation anxiety and pace their paddocks, whinnying at a high pitch when one is taken away from the other. Like my horses, captive elephants appear not to cope well without herd mates in proximity, and on being reunited also behave similarly. My horses whinny at a lower pitch, running towards each other and touching noses, while Nơ Tong and other elephants I've observed greet each other by uttering deep rumbles, trumpeting, ear flapping, and caressing each other, all signs of social bonding. Behind my house lived another elephant named Saifar. One evening, as I prepared for bed, listening to music on my phone, I heard a loud crash above me on the tin roof. Then moments later, another. When I poked my head out the window to see what was causing the racket, I caught sight of Saifar some 5 meters away, flinging a large chunk of sugarcane towards the house. It smashed against the roof, sending dirt raining down onto my head. I yelped and retreated back into my room as another chunk of cane slammed against the roof. Okay, I muttered, running to my phone and switching off the music. That seemed to solve the problem. The next day, I told Kirsty about our interaction. She's very opinionated, was her reply. Her name means thunder, after all. Saifar's thunderous nature was certainly evident on many of our walks, where she was always up ahead, safely away from the volunteers, briskly ripping branches from trees and flinging away the remnants once she had eaten the best bits. Her mahout Dao needed to constantly manage her behavior, making sure she stayed with the herd and did not get too far away from him in the dam, giving him a much more difficult job than Farsai's mahout Tong Di, for instance, whose elephant was less strident in terms of her opinions. These moments of proximity to elephants, of experiencing their personalities, their likes and dislikes, provided further insights into their experiences of agency within captivity. I could imagine Saifar in the wild, bossing around her herd mates and flinging branches at anyone who dared to make noise while she was trying to sleep, just as I could imagine Nơ Tong and Nong Lek as social youngsters and Farsai as a calm, maternal peacekeeper. The next passages I'd like to share about the mahouts that I met in Bantar Klang. I had started talking to them about the history of their village while I was working on the Surin project, and they helped me to understand what was once a heavily forested area was now arid and inhospitable to elephants. Throughout my fieldwork, I lived closely with both elephants and Goi people and met inspiring and passionate mahouts committed to improving their elephants' lives. While there are instances of cruelty and neglect in the village, I also found many instances of care and kindness towards elephants. In my study, I wanted to strike an important balance. I didn't want to excuse cruelty and neglect in the name of tradition, but I also didn't want to criticize a foreign culture without fully understanding the challenges that mahouts faced in caring for their elephants. My research tapped into a deep sense of nostalgia among mahouts related to the loss of the forest and its impact on their lives, culture, and elephants. They were very much aware of the serious welfare issues and wanted a better life for elephants, but were limited by factors such as poverty and the degraded natural environment. I turned around 50 hours of interviews with 3 generations of mahouts into 3 chapters. These mahouts included elders known as Krubas, their son's generation, and their grandson's generation. I'll read some of the stories told to me by the son's generation, including 4 mahouts named Sarot, Tongdi, Lord, and Buma. When the mahouts were children, everything they needed still came from the forest, just as it had when the Krubas were boys. There was natural food, not just for elephants, but for humans too. The 4 mahout boys were close friends and loved working with elephants. Like the Krubas, each had learned the skills of mahoutship from their fathers and grandfathers. While they were also exposed to aspects of elephant husbandry from a very young age, at just 4 or 5 years old, it was not until they were about 9 or 10 that they became more involved in the daily practices of elephant keeping. Then they enjoyed watching their fathers and grandfathers work with the elephants and would follow them as they rode into the forest or traveled to surrounding villages. Soon they would learn to ride elephants, and they spent many afternoons after lessons in the small village school riding down to the river to let the animals graze in the forest. After school, the mahout boys would pack a small lunchbox of rice, meat, and vegetables and head down to the spot where the Mun and Chi rivers connected, a distance of about 3 kilometers through lush forest. During the wet season, the river coursed with a multitude of fishes, and the mahouts would sit on the riverbank talking and fishing while their elephants roamed around them, munching away on rampant vines, low-hanging canopy, and tree roots. We would stay out in the forest all afternoon and head back before nightfall, Sarot explained. If you got lost or tired, you would always be okay. You could just close your eyes and pet your elephant, and she would take you straight home. The village was a fun place to be a young mahout. We got up to a lot of mischief, Tongdi laughed. We would fool around and do pretty silly or even dangerous things. Sometimes 6 or 7 of us would get on one elephant and ride around like that. We'd fall off all the time and just laugh about it. Almost every aspect of daily life revolved around elephants, and the boys were excited to participate in all cultural traditions, from ceremonies to training. Tongdi reminisced about one particular ceremony that was of great importance to the Goi. When an elephant was around 3 or 4 years old, we would conduct the elephant naming ceremony, he explained. We would tie a piece of paper with a name on it to a banana tree, then several others to other trees surrounding it in a circle. The young elephant would pick a tree to eat, thereby choosing its name. The names related to the weather, the elements, flowers, fruit, and auspicious items, just like the elephants I'd met on my journey, whether it was Doknern's silver flower, Farsai's clear skies, Saifar's thunder, or Wang Duan's crescent moon. Ordinations held on elephant back were used to bless men about to join the monkhood, while elephants were also used in wedding ceremonies and funerals. Burials were conducted in an area of forest named Changnyeong, where men of the Kruber's generation would rest after capturing elephants. Like the Krubers, the younger men also saw many ghosts of their ancestors in the area, who looked very different to when they were alive. Some of the ghosts had very long hands and others very long feet, Tongdi explained. We often needed to come here to collect water very early in the morning. We'd always come as a group or with elephants, as it was much too scary to see ghosts when you're alone. Before the first dirt road was built through the village in 1982, riding elephants was one of the main ways that villagers traveled around the area. At that stage, it was especially difficult to leave the village during wet season, when the only way in and out, the deep gully through the village, would course with thick, deep mud. In many places, the gully was 4 meters deep and about 3 meters wide, Sarot explained. Our houses lined one side of it with the forest on the other. There were spots where you could walk up and down where it wasn't so deep. So if you wanted to go to the other side, you would have to go to one of these spots and cross over. The funniest thing was that when people rode their elephants down there, it looked like they were hovering above the ground because you would just see their torso and head moving along. The whole of the elephant's body was down there in the gully. When the village flooded, life was very difficult. Usually, the villagers would have enough food in storage to last through any wet season. But if the rains came early, the fields would be inundated and the crops could die before the residents had a chance to harvest them. There were times where I was just so hungry, Lord remembered. I would just think about food all the time. I couldn't concentrate at school because I was so hungry. I had a little pencil, we all did, and we would write notes in class. I remember one flood season, sitting in school, so hungry and smelling the pencil. The wood smelled so good, almost good enough for me to eat it. I didn't, but that's how desperate I was, that I would almost eat my pencil. Until recently, the area around Bantai Klang has always flooded, but as the Krudabas had also explained, the situation was sometimes so dire that Goi families left to find new lodgings in drier areas. You'll find Goi people now throughout Surin who are related to us by ancestry, but who don't have elephants, Sarot noted. They left when the flooding got really bad. It was so bad that it was enough for them to want to forget the elephant culture. We understand why they left, but we could never do the same. Without elephants, we don't have a purpose. In the early 1990s, the dirt road through Bantai Klang was sealed with bitumen and cement. For a while, the villagers thought the new road might make life easier. The floods would no longer isolate them, and they could travel to the city by moped to buy food from the local markets. But as Sarot explained, the road was the worst thing to happen to Bantai Klang. Now anyone could come through the village. Trucks and cars came rumbling through, bringing outsiders who cut down the trees, making quick money selling them for lumber, paper, or furniture. The Goi cleared even more land for rice and other crops as their subsistence lifestyle dwindled. Within a few years, almost the entire forest had been destroyed, and the once quiet village became scorching hot and vociferously noisy. After that, the Goi's culture changed very quickly, and their elephants' welfare suffered enormously. There was nowhere for the elephants to roam or anything for them to eat, Sarot explained, and it was dangerous for them to be loose with all the traffic coming through the village. We also needed to stop them from roaming around and destroying all the rice fields, so we had to start chaining them up and feeding them by hand. The Surin government became aware of the Goi people's financial struggle. They devised a plan to plant eucalyptus in various areas around the village and buy the wood back from the Goi if they tended to the trees. The eucalyptus was to be used for wood chips and paper. It offered an income, but the venture made the land even more arid and used so much water that the river level dropped even further, rendering the land increasingly infertile. Now the need to buy elephant food became even more urgent. The Goi had to work the rice fields more intensively and also develop new areas to plant and upkeep fields of napier grass and sugarcane to feed their elephants. This was a long process with limited yield, which took up the better part of each day to tend to. This meant chaining the elephants up under their shelters and leaving them while they went to work. The mahouts would provide the basics of care for their elephants, but much of the passion and love for spending time with the animal just for the sake of it had gone. The disappearing forest was symbolic of a new stage in mahout-elephant interactions in Bantai Klang and its surrounds, and relationships in a tight-knit community were now affected by serious economic and environmental changes. Elephants suffered greatly as a result of deforestation. Not only were they chained up for almost all of the day, but they could also no longer socialize, had very few chances to wallow or forage, and became more aggressive as a result. Their health also declined. Now primarily eating food produced by humans, elephants were denied important nutrients, which led to physiological changes. As Sarot explained, elephants are much smaller than they were in the past. Their reproductive ability and health have declined. The animals also suffered emotionally due to their social isolation and the stressful conditions of living in a built-up environment. I'll now read a little bit from the next chapter, which starts with Sarot's perspective. The The background to this is that due to the lack of elephant food in the village, he decided to move to Bangkok with his elephant Janjao to beg on the streets. But this was a terrible situation for both of them. Sarot grew concerned for Janjao, who had developed stereotypical behavior and was worryingly thin. The whole experience was wearing them both out. He decided to head home, but things were the same as when he'd left, with no elephant food and no way of making an income. Friends who were working in elephant camps in other parts of the country would call him to tell how great the work was. There was plenty of tourists, lots of money, and the camps would take care of accommodation or the elephant food, as well as providing meals for mahouts. One friend at a camp in Pattaya was particularly convincing, so Sarot used all his savings to book a truck to take him and Janjao mother's Saibua to the coastal resort city, 100 kilometers east of Bangkok, leaving Janjao at home with his family. Sarot would arise early every morning to feed Saibua grass and sugarcane from trucks that would arrive twice a day, before taking tourists for hour-long rides around the camp. Life was not too difficult, but not easy either, he told me. He was making decent money, Saibua had plenty of food, and Sarot was much better off financially than in either Bantaklang or Bangkok. But there were not always enough tourists, meaning that his income could be limited because he relied on commissions and tips for each ride on top of his usual salary. After a few months, Sarot moved to another tourist camp, this time in Hua Hin, a seaside resort town in the Gulf of Thailand. A friend had promised him he would make far better money, but this did not eventuate. I worked for a long time without payment, always asking when I would get some money, and when they always said soon, I never received anything. For that reason, I decided to move again. Over 7 or 8 years, Sarot and Saibua worked in 5 different elephant camps. It was costly to hire a truck to move from camp to camp, but the promise of better money or conditions would be his incentive time and time again. Overall, this period of employment benefited Sarot and his family financially. Sometimes he made up to 70,000 baht, around $3,000 a month, but the work also took its toll. I really missed my family, Sarot told me. Life in the village was difficult, but I had the support of the community. Sarot also missed the spiritual traditions and Goi culture, where elephants are more than just tourist attractions. He wanted to go home, but there was nothing there for him and no food for Saibua. It was better to keep working and hope one day that things would change. It was 2005 and Sarot was working at a camp in Hua Hin when he first learned about a new elephant welfare initiative in Bantaklang called Take Me Home, which was to begin on the 1st of January 2006. Take Me Home is intended to incentivize Goi mahouts to return to Bantaklang by providing them with a stable monthly income to keep their elephants on site. The initiative was primarily intended to reduce the number of mahouts and elephants begging on the streets of cities around the country. 4 years later, street begging would be banned outright. For many mahouts, coming home to Bantaklang was about much more than the money. They wanted the Goi mahouts to come back and rejuvenate the elephant culture, Sarot explained. This meant we could come home and stay with our families. Sarot returned to Bantaklang in October 2005 and, along with other mahouts, set up a small forest rehabilitation project within the village to prepare for the influx of elephants. Soon, Tong Di also returned home, where he joined Take Me Home with Fa Sai, taking on her care from his brother. Tong Di was excited about the initiative. There'd never been anything like it. It was a great opportunity for Goi men to come home and not have to go anywhere else to make a living. But the initiative did not take off as well as the government had hoped. The money did not compare to what could be made in camps, and the eternal problem of elephant food remained. Many of the mahouts who came home soon returned back to the camps with their elephants. Staying in Bantaklang became more profitable when the government developed the small-scale tourism venture within the village, including the circus and elephant rides, which offered additional income. The new form of elephant tourism in the village started to attract tourists, primarily Thais, who came to the village and contributed to the local economy. However, as Sarot noted, while these aspects of tourism were beneficial for the village, the new state of play was different to how the Goi had traditionally worked with elephants. When it comes to life, earning money is really important, he said. We don't really have any knowledge about business, but we need to adapt to changes in capitalism involving elephants and find ways to support ourselves. We raised our elephants based on what we were taught by our ancestors, but things are different now. People whose livelihoods depend on elephants must find the best way to make money using what they have available. The final 4 chapters of my book are diverse in content. One recalls my experiences volunteering at Burman Emily's Elephant Sanctuary in northern Thailand, which was an incredible experience and one of my favorite parts of my journey. Another shares my fieldwork at the Sarin Roundup, a yearly festival involving elephants and mahouts from around Thailand, and some stories told to me by Lao Isan mahouts. In another, I talk about the Golden Triangle Asian Elephant Foundation, who've been so generous in hosting my talk today, and their work with the resort Anantara Golden Triangle Elephant Camp. I'd like to read a little of that chapter now before briefly turning to the unexpected ending of my book. I had thought about Anantara many times during the past few weeks, mainly due to my conversations with Lord in Bantai Klang, who had worked at Anantara Golden Triangle Elephant Camp for many years and was still considered head mahout. Lord had first started working at the resort after John Roberts, Anantara's director of elephants and director of the GTAEF, found him begging on the streets of Bangkok with his elephant and offered him a job. Lord had explained how working for Anantara had changed his life, providing him with an income that had given him and his family a lot of opportunities and freedom. Lord had also described Anantara's interesting setup. Of 30 elephants, 8 were used in a small-scale tourism venture that primarily involved bareback riding and a mahout training course for tourists, while 22 others were involved in the GTAEF's research program, whereby veterinarians, biologists, and conservationists could visit to conduct social and behavioral research. Lord helped guide both the tourism and research aspects, working with tourists wanting to learn mahoutship skills in an organized weekly or monthly program, and helping researchers work with the elephants, for example, by giving the animals commands so that biologists could study areas such as foot health and reproduction. He also worked as a mahout ambassador, responsible for finding other mahouts and elephants to employ. Passionate about supporting positive mahout-elephant relationships, John Roberts had developed a program that reconnected mahouts to their traditional culture by offering them roles more akin to the mahoutship of the past, living and working alongside elephants amidst fields and forests, rather than the city streets or tourist camps. Anantara offered a train the trainer course, offering elephant training sessions for mahouts that encourage more gentle methods, such as positive reinforcement and target training. With whole families living on site, Anantara offered plenty of opportunities for the mahouts' children to become involved in aspects of mahoutship, keeping the culture alive through the generations. Our hope here has been to provide a model for responsible tourism that keeps the mahouts and their elephants off the streets and ideally away from tourist camps, John explained. We want elephants to be in a better place. We can't stop mahouts from leaving if they want to try something else, but we try to provide conditions which keep them here. The most important thing that we do is to ensure that elephant welfare is at the highest standard possible, both by encouraging sustainable forms of tourism and offering research programs that are scientific and involve a range of people with appropriate knowledge. This scientific perspective utilizes studies of elephant behavior to establish and fulfill the animal's needs, such as peer-reviewed research on roaming and herd behaviors. This aims to determine the ideal conditions for elephants in captivity, while also creating tourism standards and guidelines. As John explained, this scientific approach can be used to develop sustainable forms of elephant tourism that successfully balance welfare and conservation concerns with the deeply entrenched traditions of Indigenous elephant people. After all my amazing fieldwork experiences, I started to tie up the research in 2015. By the end of 2019, the book was almost complete, but I still had a few more gaps to fill and wanted to head back for one final trip in 2020. But due to COVID-19, this was not to be. In Thailand, no tourism meant that mahouts were out of work, and conservation and welfare projects lost funding from tourists. This profoundly affected elephants, many of whom were at risk of starvation. In Bantai Klang, 300 elephants and mahouts returned home after the tourist camps closed, meaning that sources of elephant food were pushed to their limits in an already arid area. While tourist sites are slowly reopening, it may be a while for the industry to return to its pre-pandemic state. In the meantime, there are plenty of ways to help elephants and mahouts. can visit my website, which is nikkisavvides.com, for a list of organizations that receive donations. As a final note, I hope that my book encourages people to become involved by donating or even visiting the welfare and conservation projects I studied and others like them. And of course, I also hope that my book contributes to ongoing discussions about the best way forward for helping elephants now and into the future. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. It means a lot to me to have you here tonight and to have just spoken for 40 minutes from my book, which is very, very exciting to share finally. I do have a QR code here, which would take you to my publisher's website, or if you prefer, there is a link there both to the publisher's website and to my own website where you can buy the book. Yeah, and now I'm ready for some questions.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Brilliant, brilliant to hear some of the backstory and the history and some of the older history of Bantaklang. It must be said, there's a few stories in there that even I haven't heard, and I've been hanging around. Well, you immersed yourself. I've been hanging around on the outskirts, so it shouldn't be too surprising. But very, very nice to hear some of the old guys' stories.
Yeah, the Kruber stories are particularly interesting as well. Those kind of age 72 to 92, I think.
Yeah.
At that time, yeah.
And that's exactly, and unfortunately,
Tapping and
Mormule, yeah, unfortunately has died, and we're losing the old stories as well. So thank you for writing them down, and I look forward to reading the book. We do have some questions on Facebook. I also say, very interesting to read about what we were doing in 2015. You should come back sometime. Not a lot has changed, but I think most of it still rings true. We no longer put guests on elephants, but everything else is still there. And I
mentioned that in the book, actually, that now you've moved to the walking with observational.
Yeah, which and to be honest, I'm not sure is necessarily better for the elephant or not, but it's certainly something that's there, and it's the way the world is turning. But yes, interesting, and talking through some of the things we've learned since then, and some of the mahouts we now currently have on site. There's a lot of thanks coming in from all sorts of people, but I will read some of the questions.
Okay, thank you.
Since my support crew are off helping elephant people at the moment. Okay, so first of all, more of a general one from Marty McMahon saying, what was it like to work up close with elephants? How did the elephants react to humans?
It was kind of a combination of things for me. I think early on when I was doing my work, tactile experiences were a real big thing in Thailand. So it was a lot of washing and patting and touching elephants. So I think at first I thought of elephants as being generally very friendly, and most of the elephants I have, been in close contact with, being female elephants, have been, on the less aggressive side. They have been more friendly. But I did have a couple of experiences, which I recount in the book, with bull elephants, which were not so friendly. And these are examples of them being in must, which is the basically the hormonally charged, sexually active period for bulls, when you basically do not want them raging through villages, as was the case in one situation that I talk about in the book. But on the whole, yeah, it was very much an experience mediated by the mahouts. So I felt safe while those things were happening. There was Sarot, who was one of the mahouts who I talked to in Bantaklang. He had an elephant early in my research called Nuning, who is basically his possessive girlfriend. So because Sarot was basically my research assistant for a lot of the research, and I talked to him a lot, throughout the many months that I was in Bantaklang, she would get very pissed off at me for hanging around with him all the time. They would literally walk around with holding hand and trunk, boyfriend and girlfriend, walking around the village. And if I came up and started talking to him, she would glare at me. And she even booted me out of the way with her belly at one point. So, and she would love to splash me in the river as well. So a wide range of personalities and experiences, really, going from the friendly to the slightly scary.
Yeah, it sounds. And speaking as a man, females can be a little bit dangerous as well. They're not necessarily jealous, but yes, it's as you say, a very wide range of characters.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, here we go. Joanna Haddock asking, from your experience with elephants in Thailand, what advice would you give to other tourism industries around the world reliant on animals, given that deforestation and global tourism are probably only likely to increase?
Really good question. I think that the things that I've learnt from Thailand have been that this sort of gradual but sort of revolutionary shift towards lower impact tourism is the way to go. Obviously, with the situation being so that if animals and the people who rely on the animals for an income are dependent on tourism, then it all comes down to finding ways to do tourism in the least invasive way possible. And I think there is already a big shift, both in practice and in theory within tourism, that is looking at ethics and looking at the best way to ensure that, interactions between tourists and animals are kind of mediated in a sensible way. Not so much, part of it is obviously the danger that's involved especially if you've got animals that are not happy, and you've got tourists, encountering them in these spaces. So yeah, I think it's the way forward is going to be this sort of non-invasive, more observational tourism. And I think what's interesting in Thailand has been that sort of had to rub off onto even more traditional sites now, because tourists are starting to demand sort of different conditions from animals. So yeah, I think that's probably going to be their future.
I think so. And then the next trick is going to be how to scale it up, because at the moment we are looking after, it is looking after quite a few elephants, but they're not yet enough, not yet enough. And so it's one of the things that our research is looking at the moment is things that how it can be scaled up to look after even more elephants. But yes.
Yeah, for sure. Because there's definitely, I know a lot of little projects where it's maybe 2 or 3 elephants who've been, retired from tourist camps. But, when you think of the thousands that are out there, and also the space constraints as well.
How to look after bulls. Anyway, we're here and we're working. We're here and we're working on it.
Yeah.
Okay. So a question about COVID. How has COVID border shutdowns impacted elephants and the mahout lifestyle? You touched upon that fairly well.
I feel like, John, you have a much better perspective on this, because this is one thing I couldn't really study by being stuck here during COVID. So I know from what you've said, you were basically completely shut down this time last year and the year before.
Yes. So to answer that, it really has made life very, very difficult. We luckily, or by design, have a good financial setup and had money in the bank, and we're based and have a lot of land to work on. So we came through better than most, but it has left a lot of elephants and a lot of these people who, I think what was your phrase? Something without elephants, our life doesn't make sense, or something along that, which very nicely underlines that people, when the tourism dollars disappeared, the mahouts did not abandon their elephants. And I was worried in the very beginning that the elephants would fare worse than they did, but I came to realize that there is still this traditional knowledge, and people, despite the deforestation, people have been looking after elephants in Thailand and keeping them alive for thousands of years. And so it wasn't so much really the starvation, but lack of income, so human starvation, lack of income, and also a change of diet. The diet's definitely degraded. And who knows what's going to happen next? As you say, we're slowly opening up in tourism, but I hate to say we're all right, Jack. We're doing okay, but unfortunately, most of the elephants are still in the idea of mass tourism, and the tourism that seems to have come back is the small group tourism, which hopefully will start to drive the change we were talking about to lower impact tourism as well, because small groups tend to want that. It's just a question of how many tourists will come in and how long we can keep doing that, feeding the elephants. So yes, it's been very tough. Almost zero business. Another nice thing for COVID. It seems odd to say, but I try to look on the bright side of everything if I can. A lot of Thai tourists have been traveling because the borders were shut down. But of course, Thai people, outside the real tough times when everything was locked down and there were curfews, Thai folks could move within Thailand. And a lot of Thai people are looking for low impact elephant tourism. It's somewhat facetiously called it Instagram tourism, but it is a lot of it driven around having a nice photograph taken with yourself with an elephant in a wild setting. And that has helped keep some elephants going. There are some camps who've perfected the art of providing that, and it's really good for the elephants and for the guests as well. We haven't yet totally perfected it, but we're doing our best to copy. If you're listening, I get told off for copying, but yes, that's a nice thing, and hopefully the Thai tourism can keep, because we never looked in the past too much to domestic tourism. I think as elephants, people would ride an elephant when they were very, very young. They'd done it once, they didn't want to do it again. It was mainly all the elephant tourism was set up for the foreign markets. But now more and more Thai people are traveling and finding the experiences that we're able to provide interesting. So hopefully we can keep that up and spread that out as well.
Yeah, no, that's really great. It's interesting because as you're saying, I similarly never even thought of really talking to Thais about their experience, apart from a couple of really short conversations. I didn't talk to Thai people about their own tourist experiences within Thailand. But I guess I imagine, as you're saying, it's a little bit even a newer phenomenon as those of us who have been stuck in our countries have had to explore what our own countries have to offer.
Yeah, I mean, for the first, I guess, 18, however many years I've been here, 17, 18 years of being here, very rarely would we get a Thai guest interested in interacting with the elephants. And we, since COVID, since 2020, or 2020, 2021, we needed them. We had lots and lots of Thai guests, and they loved it. So it was a great deal of interest and a great deal of following and everything. So very good. Hopefully that's a new leaf to help make these low impact model slightly more sustainable for a greater number of elephants. Your next question, what was the hardest part, from Alicia Goss? What was the hardest part of doing research, and what was the thing you least expected to learn about elephants?
I guess the hardest part was seeing elephants in unhappy situations, which I saw many in Bantai Klang. So I think at first as well, I came in with a sort of very black and white view. I think as a lot of people who are, kind of coming in from having a first sanctuary experience and kind of seeing things very black and white. And I always say, things became as gray as the elephants as the work continued, because I started to realize how complex the situation was. So as much as I sort of had these moments of sadness, seeing elephants, without enough access to water or stuck in the sun all day or chained up nonstop for days, I also really wanted to kind of tell a story of hope. So just as I was trying to balance kind of, I guess, the academia with the travel writing stuff, I wanted to look to examples of positivity and hope and kind of explore the gray areas, but try and find the good parts. And that was the great thing about meeting these really inspiring mahouts, because to me it was kind of, in a little way, I worry sometimes that there's a hint of romanticization that I do, but I think it's those kind of mahouts who are really passionate and really understand both the ancient culture and the changes. I think it was kind of that transitional generation. They were there with the ancient culture. They've now seen exactly what deforestation have done. They've had to deal with the current elephant economy. And so they kind of really have the knowledge and the passion to guide tourism projects. And they were really great with the Surin project. And they were also really good for influencing other people in the village. So younger guys who didn't necessarily feel connected to the traditional culture. So I think their influence was really important. So I guess that was going back to the thing I least expected to learn. Not sure really. I think so much of it was just this shift from the black and white to the gray. I came in with the real assumption mahouts are always cruel and there's all these terrible problems, and the only solution is to put all the elephants in sanctuaries, and then getting to a much more sort of like, wow, this situation is so complex. Yes, there's cruelty. There's also kindness. Yes, sanctuaries work, but we can also reform traditional tourism camps to a better focus to kind of solve the problem from different directions and different prongs. So yeah, that was my long-winded answer, but yeah, that's about what it was.
Perfect answer. Okay, so Ram Mandayam is asking, do the mahouts and elephants, or do elephants change mahouts during their lifetime? Do they change, and did it make the elephants less vulnerable by forming more fluid relationships? Which is an interesting way. I've never heard it come from that direction before.
That is interesting. Yeah. A lot of in Bantai Klang, I can only really speak to that because that was the place that I spent most time and met mahouts who had changed elephants. Most of the changes were within the family. So it would be like, oh, my uncle's taken so-and-so to the camp in wherever, Pattaya, but I now have this elephant who used to belong to so-and-so, or the son of someone, or the daughter of someone, or the mother of someone. So it was kind of a family elephants cared for by an extended family as well. But there were also situations where there would be hired mahouts. So it might have either been an owner. I mean, John, you would know about this, an owner who lives somewhere else, often, not even in Bantaklang, who would have employed a mahout just to look after the elephant. This is actually the situation for Sarot and Nung Ning. He didn't actually own her. And very tragically for him and for her, with their closely bonded relationship, after he had been with her for about 7 years, the owner decided to take her away and sell her. So he basically lost that elephant, which was incredibly devastating for him. And, at some point I thought, do we try and raise money to buy her? And he just said, look, if I had that kind of money, I would spend it on my children's education. It's not, it didn't make sense to him to, but it was very devastating. So I do always think of her as that kind of example, like what life did she live after that, after losing him? And was she able to form another bond akin to that with someone else? And, it would have been a different life wherever she was. A tourism camp would have its own issues, but was it better than, some of the situations in Bantaklang? Probably not. I don't know. So yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, outside of Bantaklang, I mean, very familiar story there that I hear from Bantaklang and the traditional elephant villages. Outside in some of the camps, mahouts do change sometimes far too often. It does. I think elephants this whole business works best when there's a good relationship between a mahout and an elephant, and the elephant trusts the mahout and the mahout trusts the elephant, and in that way it's much easier to use positive reinforcement training and not use punishment. And so I think a good long-standing relationship is probably better for the elephant. And then to go on to your point with Nung Ning and your friend the mahout, this I'm going to say, I've said this a lot anyway. It was my argument, if I come to think about it, my biggest argument against captivity, and I know this is slightly contrary to what we're saying, or my biggest sadness is so often the decisions that affect an elephant's life and an elephant's emotional life are made for purely human and financial reasons. And when it sounds to me as though that elephant had a really good mahout, a really good life because she had a good mahout, and yet the owner was saying, well, no, this is my job. But yes, it's not to blame. It's just one of my biggest. If people ask me quite a lot about elephants in captivity, and that's one of my biggest sadnesses. And we've lost elephants here due to exactly the same thing. We've had elephants very, very happily bonded with mahouts and elephants, friendship groups, and then just one day, because somebody doesn't get along with somebody's wife, or some family gets divorced somewhere 1,000 miles away, the elephant has to go back home and do something different, and people not. When those decisions are made, I think people don't pay enough attention to the elephant's emotional needs. But anyway, it's not my show. It just reminded me very much of what your story reminded me very much of certain things we've had here and haven't been able to stop. And
it is just a reminder of the fact that it is an economy that those elephants live in. And I think after doing the research for a while, you start to get used to what happens within that economy, in a way that maybe in the earlier stages I would have been shocked or horrified to think of some of these things happening. So you do kind of become like, that's just how it is, but kind of being like, that's just how it is, but also not just taking that as the status quo that can't be changed. And you know what I mean? There's always a chance for change. There's always a chance for evolution. And, it's as much as you can accept, okay, this is how things are. It's an economy, and the things that work a certain way, there's still a way to slowly shift those things so that they start to work more positively for elephants.
I think that's as good a final word as we'll come up with. I don't think there are any other questions. I think that's entirely correct. I mean, it's where you called it romanticism, and there was a little bit in there, but also you struck a nice balance of focusing on the positives without whitewashing everything and saying it's perfect. So I look forward to downloading or buying your book and reading it in full, particularly the Kubayai stories, and making my team read the Bantaklang history, because that bit about the forest, actually, as I say, I didn't understand how forested it was even in the 1980s. I first went in there 2003 or 4, and it was already pretty barren by then. So how quickly that happened.
Extremely quickly, yeah.
And
they still haven't adjusted. That's part of the problem. Yeah.
Cool. There's the Zoological Parks Organization have a good big reforestation project, but still not a great adjustment yet going on. Okay, Nikki, thank you very much for this.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for hosting. Thanks everyone for coming along.
please do buy the book, everybody, so get some more details. There was a lot of talk on the Facebook chatter. Apparently some of you had trouble getting into the meeting. But now you're here now because you left a message. I will as always leave this recording live on Facebook, or leave it on Facebook for in perpetuity, and then I will in a little while upload it to YouTube as well, our YouTube channel, and so you will get plenty of chance to see it, and I will hopefully you'll get many other views, Nikki. After that,
yeah,
all that remains. Thank you very much. And
fantastic. Thank you so much, John. Thanks for having me.
No
Enjoyed
problem.
myself very much.
Thank you.
Great. And bye, everybody.